All right, so good afternoon, everyone, again, for those joining us online too. We're going to get started with our exercise where you will be helping us to understand why human rights principles are important to engineering. I will start by introducing my co-authors, and I will let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Professor Stein.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Michael Stein. I'm the co-founder of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. We're approaching our 20th year. We began by helping to participate in the negotiation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which you'll see in just a moment. And I've worked in 46 countries on implementing it on the ground. I also and my colleagues continue to work at the UN, agencies, government levels, but most of all people with disabilities and their representative organizations. If I had to describe our work, although you could go to www.hpod.org, I would say that it's trying to inject disability into areas where disability is relevant, but has not been considered until now. So the CRPD is a classic example of that, a paradigmatic example of it, but also including disability in the Sustainable Development Goals, whereas it was not included at all in the Millennium Development Goals, getting Security Council Resolution 2475 on conflict and people with disabilities, pushing for inclusion in business and human rights, which we have not been successful with at all. Two pieces, by the way, in the entire world written on disability, business, and human rights, two, all by me and my friend. But we're also pressing on climate change and climate justice. And there we've got a small handhold, and we're starting to see movement forward, including issuing the first handbook on disability and climate justice for people with disabilities. It's written in easy read. It's being distributed globally by UNICEF. It's on the World Bank's website, and it's on ours. So you're very welcome to come to our website. I look forward to working with you today. And I'll pass it over to my friend Shareen.
I will be brief because you've heard from me a lot today. So I'm Shareen Hertel, and just by way of background, for those who might have come in late, I'm a political scientist. I'm not masquerading as an engineer. And I teach jointly in the Department of Political Science and in our Human Rights program. There are a dozen of us across multiple faculties, from social work and law to education, and in Davis's case, engineering. And I've been at UConn 20 years, so it's been very exciting to be part of both our economic and social rights program, which I helped found, and then this more work over the past decade around engineering for human rights.
Thank you, Shareen. And for the benefits of those just joining us online, I'll introduce myself. My name is Chacon, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering with a joint appointment with the Human Rights Institute at the University of Connecticut, where I also co-direct the Engineering for Human Rights initiative. So let's get started by sharing the agenda for today. So we just completed some introductions. Then I will explain again very briefly what is the human rights-based approach to engineering, and then get ready to talk to your neighbors because we're going to do some group work and discussion, and then we'll be doing some final remarks by Professor Hertel and Professor Stein. So these are the learning objectives for this activity, and these are what people from the Center for Learning and Teaching, they told me to do. But in general, what we're going to do is basically discover what are the engineering for human rights principles together, right? So there's a whole framework about human rights that is not only about teaching human rights, but it's also how you teach human rights, right? And here for us it's very important that we don't really provide any kind of prescriptive framework of saying this is the way that you should do, but we want you to leave this room by understanding that these principles are actually core to the work that engineers can do. So, as a brief introduction, throughout the day we have learned that engineering is at the core of human development, right? And usually engineers, we take a lot of pride of some of the technological developments that are out there, going from energy, transportation, to communications and technology. And we have seen that the National Academies of Engineering actually established what are some of the grand challenges for the next century. But at the same time, what we have been bringing today as part of the discussion is that there are some other important issues that should be tackled as part of the engineering work, right? And this is just an example of food security in the state of Connecticut in Indiana, in the state of Connecticut, I apologize, where you could see the towns that are in color red are towns that are at very high risk of food insecurity. And yet, as my colleague, Professor Hertel, shared, Connecticut is still one of the wealthiest states in the US, yet has a significant issue of inequality. So when we talk about this to our students, that we are talking about very important problems that engineering is trying to tackle now, yet here in our neighborhood, we are still having significant issues, like, for example, access to food. And a lot of this is related to the idea of engineers as problem solvers. And this is something that some of the authors, like Professor Lucena from the Colorado School of Mines, have discussed as being problematic for community and sustainable development sometimes. This is a framework in which, as engineers, we're very used to receive problems, find the diagram, the equations, and the solution. And this is very effective in terms of technical problems, but sometimes it has very ineffective outcomes when we try to tackle those problems that are non-technical, right? And a lot of the human rights issues that we're discussing today perhaps are in the fields that are outside this technical part. So the idea is that by broadening the considerations that we do as engineers, by bringing new frameworks or bringing new discussions, we start bringing some of these non-technical problems to specific issues that becomes technical and engineers can address them. And I will go back to that idea as we're doing the workshop. So I already mentioned this, but for the benefits of those just joining us online, the Engineering for Human Rights is basically a combination of the normative framework that the whole body of human rights documents bring us that we can apply in engineering in the same way that we, for example, could apply our code of ethics. And in terms of some of the engineering challenges that are related to people with disabilities, here the map is showing the rate of poverty in the United States for people with disabilities. Perhaps the spatial distribution is not something that is surprising to many, but I would like to point out to the two squares that you see there and the rates that are shown in the legend, where we could see that the rates of poverty for people with disabilities are sometimes twice those of people without disability. And I think throughout the discussion today, the issue, for example, of intersectionality came out, where we see that people with disabilities in certain ethnic or racial groups are even having significant rates of poverty, as you can see in figure number 6 from a report that was done by the National Disability Institute, where you see that, for example, being with disability and being Black or African American could have rates of poverty that are close to 40%. And this is, very important because in the world we have about 16% of the population, which is about 1.3 billion, who have a disability, and these numbers are very similar in the United States. So we're not talking about a small percentage of the population. And what is interesting to me is that even when we control for educational attainment, still people with disabilities will have sometimes higher levels of unemployment, right? And this is what has been discussed in the literature as the disability gap. So engineers can do something about it? Yes. So in terms of how this come to be, we are using a little bit framework related to the social determinants of health that you can see in that figure. And the box in blue talks a little bit about neighborhoods and the built environment. And in a moment, you'll understand why this is so critical and important to understand the disability gap. But we see that some of the outcomes of all these systemic barriers are seen in the figure on the left, where on the right. So where you can see that for example, people with disabilities, in this case for the state of Connecticut, have higher levels of disparities compared to people without disabilities. And these are just numbers related, for example, to heart disease, diabetes, smoking, obesity, and even depression, right? Like 43% compared to 14%. And we see that this is connected to some of the things related to the built environment, where a survey highlighted that more than 25% of people surveyed in the US stated that transportation is a crucial issue, for example, to accessing jobs. And the figure there is showing that even in the number of trips in which people with disability get engaged, they tend to be much lower than those without disability. And we might think that this is, well, is kind of like normal became as part of our society, but that the point that we're trying to bring here is that this is not normal, right? And the big thing about considering people with disabilities as part of our society, as integral part of society, asks us to move from the charity model or the medical model to what is called the social model of disability. And the key message here, and I will leave it there, and I will ask Professor Stein to share a little bit about this, is that disability is the result of an impairment plus the built environment. So when we talk about the social model of disability, we're explicitly talking about how the built environment that we have around, or the environment that we have around, which includes the attitudes of people with which we interact, creates really this idea of disability, right? It's not really the impairment. So when we talk about this, then we can start thinking how engineering then could impact this framework of disability that has existed before. And I also want to mention that as engineers, we want to start living these two models of like charity or medical model, which in some way could be applicable, but the problem is that here disability is seen as an issue that the person has, right? So we're trying to fix the person rather than fixing the environment in which that person has to interact with the rest of society. That's my closing slide before we do the exercise, but I'll ask Professor Stein to share a little bit about this too.
Well, the simplest way of thinking about it is that we choose as a society to build courthouses, which are supposed to be access for justice to all, with stairs. And post offices, remember that Constitution, it's kind of been forgotten the last couple of years, about building roads and post offices with stairs. There's no need for it. It's a social choice, it's a social construction, and it prevents certain people from accessing and not prevent other people from accessing. So the question is whether we base our baseline of what is normalcy and what is expected on certain norms, and whether those are required and mandated, or whether they're simply the choices from among hierarchical people who happen to be in power. From a disability perspective, we would call that ableism, that the world is and should be about able-bodied, white, Christian, European-based heterosexual males, and that anyone who deviates from the norm has to be accommodated or has to effect changes or special pluses. And it makes us request and think about whether it's from a perspective of disability or race or sexuality or nationality or otherwise. Why is that the required norm? And in fact, is it required at all? So the social model actually puts the burden upon society to embrace people with disabilities and others, rather than to keep them excluded and to require some kind of equality plus to be part of it. And for engineers, we see that there are many innovations which were created for people with disabilities that are now used by all of society. We call that the curb cut effect. And it applies to things like curb cuts, where older people with bicycles, people with children, with strollers, can access the curb, as well as people with wheelchairs. But it's also things like voice to text and text to voice. And your Apples and your iPhones now include that as a basic provision. You need to turn it off in order not to have it. But that was created in order to allow accessibility for people with disabilities. So what is normal, what is expected, what is an add-on, is something that engineers can really spend a lot of time considering, and also considering about who they consult with, subject to tomorrow's panel in the morning. Professor Smith is moderating, about what they ought to consider as far as how to design things and who should be included and how to include them.
Thank you, Michael. So now staff from NIE will be handling some handouts, so please be attentive to that. And we will actually start our activity by forming groups. But before we send the people online to the activity, we're actually going to do a small icebreaker where each of you will be sharing about the story of accessibility. And this will be something that will be shared internally in each group. This won't be asked to be shared with a larger group. But what we found with the larger activity, then that will be shared at the end of the group. So please start talking to your neighbor and start forming groups from 3 to 5 people. And please feel free to move around.
Cohort a little bit because I didn't write down as much as they probably did. But okay, so I'll start with our solutions. Is that what you're? Okay, so starting with our solutions, we have what we're calling the FVTS, the Flexible Venal Transportation System. That's basically a smaller like bus system that's sort of in between the larger arterial system that would perhaps go and pick up disabled members of the community who can't make it to the main corridor. We put that under distributive justice, and the CRPD articles are number 29 and 24 through 30, and potentially some others. Did you want us to go through all of them or just one? Just one. Not sure I got to that part yet, but.
Thank you. I'll come back. So we're going to go over here and hand it off.
All right, so very quickly for those online, please use the Slido to start posting your remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, so some of the solutions that our group discussed was around additional staffing to support both the lack of help to get on the bus or the skipping of stops, and also to address some of these non-visible disabilities like the psychosocial and the cognitive behavioral things. That additional staffing would be critical. And in terms of the principles behind that is both participation and distributive justice. And then the articles that we looked at were Article 19 and Article 26, which kind of talk about expanding access to recreational areas and green spaces, and then also just ensuring transit opportunities for all. And then another similar solution was kind of this idea of microtransit, optimized routing to ensure that the maximum population is being serviced, and those that are being left out can be a part of the system. And that was, again, distributive principle, and then looking at Article 9 and Article 30. And then the last solution that we had was the construction of shelters at stops. Particularly, we were thinking about this around the inclement weather. While it doesn't do anything for folks traveling to the stop, at least at the stop itself, there's protection from the inclement weather. And that was, again, participation, distributive, and Article 9. And in terms of the utility of these engineering principles, it's very hopeful just to have a foundation with which to discuss these solutions, that sometimes folks don't have a common language to kind of address these critical issues, and this at least provides a platform to kind of further explore these solutions from a common place.
Before I move forward, anything further from this group or proceed?
We had a couple other solutions, but I don't know if you wanted them all. Okay, I'll do one and then you do one. Right, so we also thought integrating in flat rate fares into the system. Not sure whether it's the system is more like here in DC where you pay for how long you're traveling, or like in Boston where it's just one fare no matter how far you go. But that would make sure that people who live farther away wouldn't be sort of penalized for taking the transport for longer. And that was something that we felt like was around distributed justice. And so that was another one. I just would add to your comments around the framework that one of the things which is nice about a framework is I think a lot of these things are around distributive justice, but then when you look at the other principles, then you sort of start thinking, oh, wait, did we do that? And so having names for things that you might have forgotten to look into, I find very useful. And so I appreciated having sort of them listed out in a way that you might not otherwise sort of consider some of the things that were on the list.
Yeah, our last solution was related to signage and information, but just to add on for number 15, I think it allows you to sort of find weaknesses in some of your approaches if you haven't sort of touched on all of the different principles, so that's super helpful.
Thank you so much. And over to you.
So the only solution we really went through in detail was tailored for blind people. So we talked about having like a sound system with the transportation, both to help them, cross the road, as well as to like announce when the train or bus or what have you is coming. And we felt that kind of went through all 5, I guess, of the 5 principles of the human rights-based approach. Certainly for distributive justice, and then participation, we would assume that we would be working with blind people in the community. The duty bearers, we kind of felt, we're putting it on the city to do this, and that is their responsibility. Kind of a little spoiler alert, but for 15, that we didn't think about accountability when we first talked about it. And then when we saw that, we were like, oh, we didn't think about monitoring this at all. So we talked about having a phone line that you could call if it's broken, as well as having the city itself monitor these stations. We didn't also get a chance to go through the different articles and how that, like which articles were in there. But we did for that. Yeah.
And I think this is the next group. Am I missing? Is there a smaller group here? Okay, mini group.
Hi, yes. So many of the solutions that we came up with have already been stated. I will say that maybe we had some difficulties at the beginning coming up with solutions because we wanted to hear from the community more. So with the idea that determining the solutions would require participatory discussions with the community. So determining or selecting them before that conversation would be hard. So and we thought, the CRPD would be useful for centering solutions on community. We actually said kind of like all of the CRPD articles, or almost all of them, could help in this process. Even number 3, which wasn't listed on the handout. But some of the solutions were the ramps and the audio for other types of disability, and a network for bringing individuals to the corridor as necessary. But determining what solutions would be based on discussions with the community, and maybe looking at other communities around the world or within the country to see what has worked before.
Now I will go to this group back here.
Thank you. So our group, as with yours, a lot of the discussions that folks had that have been mentioned already, I will say our group did have a sort of foundational discussion based even on that hypothetical case of, is a new tram station even where this should be going? So that was one of our questions. So we were really looking a little bit more for what the actual needs of the community were and bringing that participation into the group. One solution that we did raise in reference to our top 3 issues, which were the actual physical presence of these solutions, inconsistent regulation, and a lack of budget to implement this. To address that, we did talk about the creation of some sort of ramp molding tool that could be used to create regulated, regular ramps that could be used with concrete, with other materials based on the particular infrastructure and the terrain, that would also allow for accountability and would allow to say if this is the ramp making tool and we put it up against the ramp and the ramp is too steep or too shallow, we have an easy way for the community members themselves to actually say, hey, this ramp is out of spec or needs maintenance, and we compared it to this tool, we can have proof of that. And also that it would allow for the creation of these ramps without the need for skilled labor or, one of the other solutions we threw out was a 3D printed ramp, but that would be really, really, really hard to do in that infrastructure. So those were a couple of the solutions that we raised. I'm not sure we quite got to 15 in the time that we had, but we had some thoughts.
I had a question for all of you who organized this or created this activity. How did you decide, or so that's good to ask this without leading the answer. Why did you put 13, 14, 15 at the end? 14 and 15 at the end in particular, as opposed to at the beginning of the activity?
Oh, yes. Well, actually, thank you for that question. This is actually part of a discussion, as I said at the beginning, where participants discover the value of the concepts rather than us telling you this is important.
Yes.
The idea is that engineers who will take this workshop, they actually realize that these principles are important. And I just gave my conclusions, actually, so thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that was great.
Darshan. All right, back here.
Hi. We might be the simplest of group. We have no solutions. We kind of thought it was detrimental to start that thought experiment and have ideas already to brainstorm for and not with. So instead, a lot of us work in community engagement practices, and so we spoke a lot about different practices we've used and applied in contexts that we understand. So I think we spent a lot of time talking about what we didn't know about the case study and what we'd like to find out to be able to help this community, to also know what types of things we could implement, and also where our resourcing and financing to do that is going to come from. One of the questions we've also had is, it seems like it's a private system, but it's the public, it's the government that's looking at it. So then we're also in regulatory, we're in the what ways can we actually interact in this system. So while we can take really great comments from the community as the government at how can you now implement this into policy to make it an actual private organizations follow those structures. So we had a really great nuanced conversation, but I will sadly have no solutions to give you today, but just really considering, I think, almost procedural justice and how we went about it, even though most of the solutions, while we like all the solutions that we heard today are all viable solutions in concept of sitting here for this hypothetical theory, but we have no idea of knowing which ones will actually be useful.
Davis, did you want to add it all? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. Got it. Yeah.
Our group echoes a lot of things we've already heard, so we wanted to really focus on what are the route to satisfactions of travelers, not just the ones that they're raising at the top level. So anyway, we didn't have all the data because we would imagine a very deep collecting process, but we made assumptions in order to address what should be happening with this new tram system, new tram station. So the first thing I'm going to say is that the main articles, a lot of the articles are relevant, but for us, the key things that we're trying to achieve in terms of that Convention on Rights of Disabled People are Articles 5, 11, 18, especially 26, and especially 30. And so we were going to do 3 features. One was when somebody showed up at the tram station, a sensor would detect that they were there. That information would flow to the system and to the nearby drivers. It would also create, like this group mentioned, an audio speaker reply, because not everyone is literate. and maybe there's more than one language in the community, so it could play into two things, saying, you know, the bus to blah, 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 or the tram is coming in 9 minutes, it's half full, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the alert station. The second thing was that we were going to experiment. Well, okay, so I have to go back to our process thing. One of our process things was not to do this as a single-phased project. There's before, there's after, that's it. We were going to actually propose, we're doing this tram station this year, and if it works well, 2 years from now we'll do another, and 2 years from now. So by having a phased approach, one of the things we were going to experiment with in the first phase here is allowing the tram. So again, we imagine that people are going to be getting used to communicating with phones. And so if we know where they're going and the schedule allows, the tram driver would be allowed to stop near where they're going, not insist they wait to the next stop that's a half a kilometer beyond. So we consider in between stops as well as at the thing. And the third thing is we call dynamic explainable fleet. That doesn't have to do with the station, but it has to do with now that we have all these data of who's waiting, who's on the bus, where are they going, da-da-da-da-da. If we needed for the bus driver to keep approximately to the planned schedule, we would actually call to a supplementary taxi or Uber or Lyft or ride-hailing, and we would pay. They would get the audio announcement, or their phone would say, actually, the tram is going to pass you by, but 30 seconds from now, a taxi is coming. You don't have to pay them. So that dynamic expanding fleet. So those are some of the things we talked about, and many more.
Did I miss anybody anywhere? Okay, Becca.
Online.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Oh, I'm
Anna.
sorry, Becca. Did you want to go? Okay,
Okay.
and then we'll do the
So
online.
okay, great. And then they're back up here? Okay. Oh, sorry. So we'll wrap here, there, and then online. Go right ahead.
So one of the things we considered was not just the physical problems of building a new transportation hub or system or improving it, was that you have to consider people with both invisible disabilities as well as visible disabilities. But you also have to consider all human beings. And for human beings, psychologists say that the most difficult times in their lives are those of transitions, whether it's births or deaths or marriages, divorces, holidays, birthdays, whatever. And so a transition in the physical transportation system is going to create a great deal of stress and a great deal of anxiety, especially in people with certain mental or cognitive disabilities. And so you need to take into consideration how you're going to accommodate that up front before the crisis occurs. Because when people become anxious, well, you've lived in America for the last few years, so you know what happens when people become anxious. But in order to keep that from getting out of hand when you're dealing with the transportation, you can create, I think someone has already said, audio alerts and visual alerts and different ways of communicating. But what you also need to remember is that you have to give the person who's going through the new transportation system a way of communicating with someone. And so one of the conventions from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is not only equal access to information, but equal ability to communicate with someone else. And so if we can't communicate with a human being, then we are at a disadvantage, and then the frustration and anger are going to grow. On a side note, I would add that there are animals that people with disabilities often have in public spaces, and so it has to be safe for them. That's just on a practical, physical level. But to take into account the invisible disabilities, was there something else that you had discussed? So that was all.
And I have my mic, so I'll bring it to the final group. Thank you.
We had discussed a lot of similar features like an awning and shelter and increasing visibility for signage. But I think more for number 15, we discussed how these frameworks are really important for not only like covering all the bases of some people who may be like coming into designing these for the first time. Maybe they might not cover everything. Like we really did not get into like a lot of the articles after we saw like them really laid out. We kind of talked more about like the concrete, like protecting services, and we didn't think about like voting and like make like all these other justices. But we did also discuss how involving those with disabilities of all kinds is really important when you're writing these frameworks and when you're coming up with these principles, because not only like these communities, but it can only be the participatory approach that a lot of people have already echoed.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to pass. Oh, sorry, Anna. The voice to Anna.
Some of the things that people submitted online from our online breakout groups in no particular order. One group talked about autonomous point-to-point vehicles, specifically geared towards people with disabilities, and that might improve accessibility. Someone else said that in their breakout group, they discussed the importance of recognizing persons with disabilities as individuals with unique needs and desires, shared some examples, and discussed the challenge of putting a price tag on human rights and the crossover between financial responsibility and social responsibility. Another group said their breakout was focused on engineering answers, and they thought that a leapfrog solution, one that eschewed, I'm not sure how you say that word, eschewed incremental changes to the existing system in favor of cutting-edge technology, was the implementation of autonomous point-to-point transit. They said this would eliminate many of the issues identified in the case study. There are currently economic challenges associated with the solution, but it might be a viable option in the near future. Another said they talked about stakeholders, which include people working in the service delivery infrastructure, bus drivers, unions, public works maintenance people. Their inclusion in designing changes would be and is crucial to transitions. Someone said they were not aware of specific policies regarding the rights of people with disabilities. However, they talked about their needs without really caring what policy anticipates them. And then someone said that localized cultural lens is key for additional transit system staff to not just merely accommodate travelers with disabilities, but also to welcome travelers.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So one quick thing before I pass it to Professor Stein to close these remarks is that just wanted to mention that some of the things that we have discussed in this case study were actually part of some implementations in a real city in Latin America. The city is Medellin, where they have been doing a lot of efforts to improve accessibility in general. And one additional thing about the workshop, if you would like to share, you like to run this with your students, actually in question 14, there, you can see that there is an optional column to actually connect this to code of ethics. So if you like to run this exercise by also connecting a specific code of ethics in engineering, this will be a useful exercise for that. Thank you all for your participation. And now I will pass it to Professor Stein for closing remarks.
And I will be fast so as not to keep us. But all your remarks were thoughtful and helpful and considerate. I would just highlight from among them a couple of things, which is, of course, resource constraints are always an issue. But I would also mention that putting in design ahead of time rather than retrofitting dramatically reduces the cost of it. So in the world of development, we're talking about 0.5% putting it in ante, whereas afterwards retrofitting can be heaven knows how much, depending upon what it is. Issues that might have been raised were equal participation. Can separate ever be equal? Can separate ever be more than equal? Getting a limo door to door may not be such a bad thing, but being in a segregated place may not be such a good thing. What is the impact on dignity? There were some very good points about including the stakeholders. people with disabilities, but also those who are laboring to enable their transportation, and looking at culture and trying to understand how to develop things in a culturally appropriate and workable manner. On the law, from someone who has spent most of his working hours for the last 23 years on the CRPD, I would just mention that it's a great framework and it got you to think about it. But at the end of the day, it's not even so much about law. It's about how you wish your societies to be developed and what sort of world we all want to live in. Whether you're taking a disability rights perspective like Jacobus Tenbrook, who created the National Federation of the Blind and Disability Studies and talked about the right to live in the world, or whether we're just talking about common decency, being neighborly, the golden rule, or however you wish to phrase it. It can be about strict legal compliance, but it also could be about what sort of world do we wish to live in. And it's important to think about this not just in terms of disability, but the aging demographic as well. By 2040, if we include people with disabilities and their households, and we include the aging population, there'll be more people over 60 than under 30. We're talking about something like 40% of global households. So how do we wish the world to be organized? What sort of world do we want to live in? How do we cooperate in solidarity with each other, not simply in terms of compliance with legal standards, of which there are a lot, we only gave you some, but also just about how we want to develop this world that we all share together. So thank you for your comments. Thank you for your participation. And Glenn, I will get out of your way.